Hello and welcome to the latest webinar from Emergency Services Times. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times. Today we turn to the topic of Martyn's Law with our partner Turtle Medical. In our webinars we ask our speakers to share their work, their insights and thoughts on the future. This webinar is a chat, there's no presentation, no slides. It's a valuable conversation that leaves you inspired to find out more. We have a Q&A function on our software today, so you'll see it on the side of your screen. Please do add questions and we'll get to them as we can through the conversation. Can I just ask you to make them short and not statements so that we can bring them into the chat this afternoon? We also offer CPD accreditation, so if you would like to take advantage of that, we will get that to you after the webinar, after this live recording, and if you watch on catch up, you'll get it within the next couple of weeks. Our plan today is to run for 50 minutes in total. So let's get started. I'll wait for my panelists to join me on screen. Excellent, there we all are. Right, so I'm delighted to introduce Mike Dowson, Phil Morton and Claire Park. Mike is Director of Turtle Medical, Phil is Deputy Assistant Commissioner at the London Fire Brigade, and Claire is a HEMS consultant with the London Air Ambulance. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
So today we are talking about Martyn's Law, and which is officially called the Terrorism Protection of Premises Act 2025, which received royal assent on Thursday the 3rd of April this year. It's intended to strengthen the security of public premises and events. There's an implementation period of at least 24 months before the Act comes into force. So the question for this afternoon, what we're going to start with is, what's the emergency services interest in this? So first of all, I'm going to ask Phil to talk to us about how the Fire and Rescue Service is interested in Martyn's Law, and in particular looking at the NILOs, and interagency liaison officers, and a little bit about Manchester Arena, which is where all of this started. So Phil, can I ask you that first question, please?
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, everybody. Absolutely, there is a phenomenal kind of impetus really on emergency services from both a professional and a moral perspective to proactively engage with Martyn's Law. Obviously, we saw the tragic event at Manchester Arena some years ago now, which really was the impetus for this piece of legislation being enacted. And as a result of that incident, a number of recommendations were targeted at the emergency services, as well as the private sector as well, requiring them to proactively prepare for this sort of event, and ultimately to mitigate the opportunity for these events to occur, but then subsequently respond to these effectively. What we saw at Manchester Arena really was an opportunity in terms of learning for us to work effectively, both in terms of blue light services, but also with our colleagues in the private sector, to gather information, to share that information, and ultimately respond and keep members of the public as safe as possible at these larger venues. So London Fire Brigade, as a result of those recommendations and subsequent recommendations linked to other terrorist attacks, such as one on London Bridge, have taken a lead role in terms of the fire sector with the National Fire Chiefs Council to determine the role of the fire sector in terms of this legislation. So that has helped us truly understand the parameters that the legislation will lay down, and then really define how we will support the wider network in terms of response. And there's an awful lot we can do proactively, and then heaven forbid an incident should occur, to ensure that our response is slick, fast, and saves as many people as it possibly can. And what is critical to that is how the emergency services work together, how we share information, how we share risk, and ultimately ensure that members of the public either leave that area through effective evacuation or receive the appropriate care. So in the run-up to the implementation of Martyn's Law, what is particularly important is that colleagues on this call and those that are responsible for venues are proactive in this space, engage with emergency services, and sort of maintain awareness of the legislation, and then take the necessary steps to reach out, to link in, to share important information, and ultimately give us the tools so that, heaven forbid, these sorts of incidents occur, we're effective in our response. And the National Interagency Liaison Officer that you speak to is a conduit amongst the three blue light services, ultimately to come together to effectively and efficiently work to save as many people on the scene. So they are trained specifically in the language and response mechanisms of all of the blue light services, ultimately to ensure that response is slick and effective.
Lovely, thank you. That's a very clear explanation. So Claire, I wonder if you could offer a health perspective on the same question, which is why is the health sector, I know you represent a part of it, but just broadly the interest they have in this legislation.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this. As those people know about Martyn's Law, it doesn't specifically specify anything about the health response in terms of treatment or in terms of medical kits. But I think if we look back to Manchester Arena and where this started, there are a lot of learning points from across the emergency services that Martyn's Law kind of starts to bring together. And when you start to look into what it asks venues to do, it becomes clear that planning is a really important part of that. And from my point of view, if I look at it from a point of view of someone that's injured within a venue at an incident like Manchester Arena or any other terrorist attack, we know that there are some casualties that unfortunately there's nothing we can do about to save. There isn't an intervention that can save them however much time we have, and there are some people that will be okay, but there are a number of casualties who have survivable injuries that are almost have a time critical space to do something in, and that window of opportunity for those individuals can be very narrow, and they can stack up to a number of windows of opportunity to save them. And implementing simple life-saving interventions along with plans to get those casualties to the definitive care that they need to continue to give them that window of opportunity to save their life is absolutely vital in giving us a situation where we prevent any potentially preventable deaths and save as many lives as possible. And so when we come to the planning of this, if a venue or anyone who finds themselves involved in any of these events has never thought about what that response would look like, where they might find kit to help them, or where they might take those casualties out via which route and in what way, then they're already a step behind. And as we know from everyone that's given evidence of attending such events, it's a horrendous incident to find yourself in and very overwhelming. And having some simple steps to prompt yourself to know where to start is really, really important. So from my point of view, looking at how we do the best to save lives in the future, it's about planning all elements of that. So from a health point of view, it's about thinking about what kit you have available, how you might get those casualties out, so whether you have stretchers available, and if people know where to find those kits, and then any venue medical responders being able to link into the emergency services responding, and use of the same language, not just across all of the emergency services, but between the emergency services and the venues and any of the private medical providers that might be providing medical first aid at those venues. As we saw in Manchester, that's another area that doesn't have strict legislation in terms of what the medical training should be for people at any event, really. And so actually if we kind of extend it to simple plans and common language, using something that the emergency services are using, such as 10-second triage, which I think we might talk about later, is also something that can bring in that common language that we know helps to speed things up across the board. So I think from a health point of view, if we take John Atkinson as an example, I think most people who've heard the inquiry results will know that John unfortunately died an hour and 16 minutes after the bomb went off, and he died from what would have been compressible bleeding from both of his legs. If he'd had tourniquets put on his legs earlier than they were, and if he'd been evacuated earlier than he was, the chairman said he would probably have survived. And what we want to do is avoid a situation like that in the future. And so I think that should be an impetus to everyone to look at how they can try and set things up to do their best to avoid that.
Yes, very much so. And your clear messaging about simplicity, I think, is a key one there. So, Mike, in terms of that simplicity of language and the process of planning that Claire maps out there, what are people saying to you as a supplier of the equipment that could be used in these venues? What's the messaging coming from people who are talking to you?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I mean, to echo Claire, yeah, there's no specification of what's required from the medical preparedness, but when you start looking at risk assessments, looking at the type of injuries that might happen in a mass casualty incident, they're kind of asking us what do we need, what is the medical equipment, what's already available. We looked to the work done by the Daniel Baird Foundation, who were formed in 2017 and kind of created the first bleed control kits with West Midlands Ambulance Service. And it's a case of building on the work which has been done there, putting it into an environment where it could be accessed by the trained professionals who work at these venues. It could also be accessed by members of the public who are you'll have a go here, as it were, who find themselves in this unfortunate situation and want to do everything they can to try and preserve life until the emergency services or until a trained person can get in and take over. And then that brings the question of training. What specific training do venue staff require to use some of this equipment? Yes, it might be designed that anyone can use it in an emergency, but as with everything in life, if you've been trained, if you've experienced kind of trying to use this equipment on scenarios, you're going to be better prepared in a real life situation to actually use it. So it's kind of trying to help formulate what training plans should look like for these venues to train their staff and upskill them to be able to use the equipment in an emergency.
Yes, and I think some of that has to be about proportionality as well. And so not everybody needs to have every skill, but in terms of what we're being told by the Home Office, so there's going to be more communications about through the implementation period of the legislation. Now, in terms of that, what do you think would be good practice here? I mean, Phil, in terms of thinking about what you've been talking about with fire services, if you were to go in and see a venue and you were doing it from a fire safety inspection point of view and your staff were in there doing that, what kind of conversations could they have usefully in that environment with those people who already have responsibilities elsewhere in legislation, and then maybe talk about this as well? Is that a place in which you could start those kind of conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. I think, as I mentioned previously, proactivity in this space is critical, especially with complex and larger venues. It's an opportune time for responsible people to start to engage with the legislation and prepare for its implementation. As you mentioned, London Fire Brigade has sort of two legislative roles in this space. The first is around prevention and protection, which sits within something known as the Regulatory Reform Order. And then there's a piece in the Fire Rescue Services Act which speaks to planning and preparation and information gathering. So our prevention and protection colleagues are usually, or more commonly known as, fire safety inspectors. They will visit certainly large venues and stadia quite frequently throughout the year, and there's a real opportune time to start to liaise with those individuals to understand the parameters of the legislation and to get some good practice advice. And those individuals certainly can signpost responsible people to key information that will help them start to undertake their site-based risk assessments and identify appropriate control measures. In a similar vein, frontline firefighters will also attend a range of properties, including venues and large stadia, etc., to gain operational information which supports response. That falls under the Fire Rescue Services Act, and the specific paragraph is known as 72D. So that's our information gathering piece, and we do that regularly with a range of buildings in London and across the United Kingdom. And that really is an opportune time for responsible people to provide planning assumptions, plans, identify key hazards, identify evacuation protocols, muster points, potentially where medical kits may be provided. And that ultimately results in us preparing, heaven forbid, for an incident at that venue. That information is held on a confidential database, but is shared with blue light partners where it's appropriate to do so. And that obviously facilitates both our own attendance within the fire sector, but also police response, ambulance or medical response to scene. And quite commonly, we will share simple plans of a building with police colleagues or medical colleagues to expedite their access and egress, for example. But all planning in this space is extremely useful and certainly advised. And we can certainly support and offer guidance and signpost responsible people to key pieces of information, and certainly prompt for key pieces of information that will ultimately assist our operational response.
Yes, I think that's quite helpful in that you're doing that proactive work under the two pieces of legislation that you mentioned there, which means that fire services are going into buildings and having conversations with people who may be wearing both hats of responsible under the fire safety legislation and responsible under this legislation. But of course, from a health point of view, they're not going to be able to know whether the provision is proportionate, whether the provision is correct, or is as simple as Claire says it should be. So let's sort of unpack a little bit about what it is that might be in a venue. So Mike, when somebody is thinking about planning, how am I going to make sure that my venue with my 200 plus or my 800 plus numbers of people, I'm going to have the right thing in the right place, the name of the webinar. What's the sort of starting point for that? What does this bag of tricks look like? And how can it be simple in the way that Claire describes, and so that people can use it in a confident way when, as Mike says, this is a really difficult situation. So how do we set people up to succeed here?
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge because you want to give everybody all the tools in the world, and at the same time you need to understand that these are going to be used in really high stress situations, potentially by people with no medical skills whatsoever. So the approach we try and take is to create a really well laid out kit. There's 4 real key pieces of medical equipment we put in the kits. There's a Cerlox hemostatic gauze, that's a packing gauze for kind of real catastrophic bleeds. We've got 4 trauma dressings, that's kind of a large elasticated dressing, which will apply pressure and help kind of control a catastrophic bleed. We've got a couple of windlass tourniquets, designed to hopefully be quite straightforward to use, obviously reduce or stop blood flow to limbs. And then we've got a vented chest seal. Used probably least frequently what we've seen in the kits, but have been used where there's a puncture wound to the chest cavity, and obviously there's the risk of air getting in and crushing the lung and causing suffocation ultimately. So they're the kind of key medical equipment, but then there's all the supporting equipment to go with that. There's the PPE, there's the gloves, the goggles, face masks, CPR face shields, foil blankets for keeping patients warm and kind of potentially dry if it's an external venue. So it's all about trying to create the layout, make it really simple, make it understandable. We include a very basic triage sheet in the kits, which will explain to people what they want to use where. One of the great things that Daniel Baird Foundation created was what's called a body map, and it very simply identifies on the body where you would use each component. It's all color coordinated. So if it's kind of a normal leg injury, it would suggest that the tourniquet is the most simplistic route to take. If it's a chest injury, the chest seal. And it's all about kind of trying to make it as simple as possible for an untrained member of the public to use, with the benefit that if it is then a trained member of staff using it, they're going to have more in-depth knowledge and know exactly what they're going for, have familiarity with the kits. And then the other side of this is where you put the kits in a venue. We're starting to do a lot more site surveys with large venues to walk around with their kind of key staff and decide where they actually need to put these. Is it about 1 or 2 kits in key locations? It's not always worth having them all locked away in a first aid room, which only one person has the key to during an event. They need to be quick access and available throughout the whole venue. So it's really important for people to start thinking, where are these kits? Can everybody get to them in an emergency?
Yes. So you make 2 good points there in terms of what's in the kit and then where it should be. Claire, in terms of your sort of plea for simplicity, what Mike's just described there sounds like there's lots going on, but actually there's almost like the bits at the top of the kit, I imagine like a bag with things at the top, are the things that people need to get to first. In terms of the triage that Mike talks about, you were the sort of brains behind 10-second triage from Manchester. I wonder if you could just take us through that a little bit in terms of how that helps the first responders, but could potentially be used in venues as well.
Yes, of course. I think that the key for 10-second triage, we developed it actually for all emergency service responders, with the hope that it would be useful for anyone finding themselves in that situation. But it was specifically designed for not necessarily even health responders, but for non-health responders. So we trained specifically with fire and police to develop it. And the principle behind it being that we know the things that kill people in traumatic events in the first kind of 10 minutes or so are external bleeding that we can stop. So things that are bleeding from a limb or from a junction, so like a groin or an armpit where we can press on it, and opening an airway. So if someone's got an occluded airway and they can't breathe, then just putting a jaw thrust on to open their airway, putting them in the recovery position to maintain that, can be enough to allow them that window of opportunity to be alive when the next level of response gets there. So the idea behind 10-second triage was not only to prioritize people for evacuation and to give people a system for seeing who's already been seen, because if you see a tag on them, then you know someone's done that initial assessment, you can move on to the next patient. But even if you don't have the tags, the real priority for us was that the blue diamonds on it, which tell you those life-saving interventions. So focusing on stopping any external bleeding you can see, and opening an airway, and then moving on to the next casualty, and then thinking about starting to move people out. And for me, that's the next step. And we've seen some really good progress with 10-second triage being used now across fire, police and ambulance across the UK. So that sort of the benefits of the joint understanding of communication, everyone using the same terminology, everyone using that same system, makes it exponentially helpful. But then the next step of, once everyone's tagged, starting to move them out. And I think we know from the Bataclan, everyone was carried out in barriers. From Manchester, everyone was carried out in barriers and hoardings. And that's not simple. That takes 10 people to carry someone out on, because they're awkward and they're uncomfortable for the casualties. So having some simple structures like carry sheets that allow people to carry people out is the next step in that casualty flow maintenance. But taking it back to that first step, which was your question, I think it's that initial response, trying not to be overwhelmed by it, thinking what are the two things that make a difference in the first few minutes, and that's stopping bleeding. And I don't think it has to be with complicated hemostatic gauze like Celox, as Mike explained. It can be just getting someone's t-shirt and pressing it into the wound, because it's the pressure that's really going to stop the bleeding, and getting a tourniquet on if it's a leg wound, and remembering that catastrophic bleeding doesn't have to be spurting up the wall. We see people not understanding about the bleeding seeping into clothing and into the floor, like John, and not realizing necessarily that was catastrophic bleeding. But you can put a tourniquet on and take it off later, and we actually see, to be honest, I see a lot of tourniquets go on that need to come off later, but that's fine. We can reassess that in a casualty clearing station and take it off. So it's about that initial response, having a framework, having something to reflect back to say, okay, I know where I'm starting, and then starting that system, and then the emergency services arriving and carrying on. If it's the same terminology, that's even better, because that means there's no kind of confusion in terms of what people mean.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, isn't there? There's a lot about timeliness, about confidence, about knowing what to do, but that if you don't, it isn't, like you talked about the tourniquet, it might actually not be needed, but better to have it than not have it. So I think there's something about that kind of confidence there. And again, coming back to
Sorry, I think we don't want people to worry about getting something wrong. Yeah. There's, in the past, people have worried about doing first aid and doing something wrong. And I think, there's definitely, people want to stay, people want to help, and we want to empower them to do that. If they've done a course that helps them to learn what to do, then I think venues, there can be some simple, it doesn't take very long to learn those simple things. CPR included, to be honest, because it's not to say that somebody wouldn't have a heart attack in an event like this, not from an injury, but from some other cause. So CPR and defibs are still important. But having all of that kit available and some simple training, I think, can be beneficial, because we've certainly done exercises in London where, not that many years ago, where the venue maybe had a first aid kit that contained a few crepe bandages and a few plasters, which probably weren't going to deal with big bleeds from the sort of injuries that we see people unfortunately inflict in terrorist attacks.
Yes, okay. I just want to have a quick look at our questions, because we've got quite a few coming in. Just to the top, asking whether your contact details can be shared. Are you happy for me to share them in the notes for this? Yes, okay, so we can mark that one as complete. Will venues be able to achieve an accreditation in respect of preparedness? I'm not sure we're the ones to answer that, but I suspect that through the guidance that the Home Office is offering, which isn't out yet. But when that appears, that there may be something in there around that. So I'm afraid we can't answer that question today. And there's one here about equipment. What should be readily available for zero responders in publicly accessible locations? I'm not sure what they mean by zero responder. Does that make sense to you, Claire?
Yeah, a zero responder is a term that people use also as kind of bystanders. So some people use zero responders to mean bystanders. So people who happen to be there at the time that an event happens, who have that immediate window of opportunity to provide some sort of intervention.
Right. So this question is here to suggest it might lead to a shift in thinking from 222 teams. I'm not sure I understand this question. Claire, you'll be able to quick read of it and see if you can decipher it.
I can't see the questions, but 222 teams, I guess, is maybe a reflection on American kind of teams responding.
That'd be more helpful. Can you see it? Shall I read it out for you?
Yes, it might be useful to read it out.
Okay, so the question says, what equipment do you think should be readily available for zero responders in publicly accessible locations? It says NHS England are doing work on hospitals as publicly accessible locations and enhance their tier sites. I think this is going to lead to a shift in thinking from 222 teams needing to deal with medical incidents on their sites to this being a pre-hospital incident that happens to be on the hospital site.
So that's talking about hospitals, an incident happening in a hospital, is it? In terms of response and having kits available for, I think it seems to be talking about response in a hospital to a pre-hospital environment. I'm not sure if that means within the hospital itself of an incident. And clearly hospitals are venues that have more than 800 people in them often, but are not seen necessarily as a Martyn's Law venue, I guess, because it's an event as such that's constant. And they have always occurred to me as being a risk, and people in hospitals are expecting to treat the patients that are there and not some event happening within the hospital. So certainly is something that has to think about a response. But in terms of the publicly accessible location enhanced kits available throughout buildings and locations, I think that it's what we've just been talking about in terms of having simple kits that are available for people to use and not making anything more complicated than it needs to be. Bleed control and a system then to think about how we prioritize the things that can make a difference for people, and that really is about the things. So one thing that I do see people worrying about, and I think we may be confusing because we talk about pressing on injuries. If it's a chest, if it's a torso, so the 10-second triage has a diagram of a torso, so basically from your neck to just below your groin, that area can cause non-compressible bleeding inside your chest and abdomen. So what that means is you can't press on the outside to stop the bleeding. It's bleeding inside. So if it's bleeding into your chest cavity, your abdomen, your pelvis. That needs a surgeon really to fix it. So anyone that has bleeding in that area really needs to be prioritized, and that's why on the 10-second triage there are P1 or priority 1 to be evacuated, because they really are a time critical person that needs to get to that next level of medical care quickly. And that's where we come back to our stretchers. The stuff you can treat on scene is the external bleeding on the limbs, in the junctions, but the people with the internal stuff need to go to the place where someone can give them blood, get them a surgeon, and do the next bit.
Yeah, they your P1. So Phil, you will have used 10-second triage in your LFB response, and then I think other agencies in London are using it. Do you have anything else to add in terms of how that's used by the first responders who are in venues? Might be interested to know how that works.
Yeah, I think really just adding to Claire's piece, Catherine, there, all emergency services in London and predominantly across the United Kingdom will use 10-second triage and systems to that effect. The simplicity and effectiveness of that model speaks volumes. And as Claire mentioned, for all of the equipment and that a venue may provide, having a framework for those responders who may attend before the emergency services to get to work and have the confidence to work, I think it is really empowering. Beyond that, of course, it's a consistent model used by all. So if people are already sort of enacting those protocols, it obviously subsequently saves time for the emergency service responders when they attend. And of course, there's some common protocols that they will be aware have been utilised or utilised to the best capability of the individuals that have attended. And it's far easier to then subsequently understand what care that casualty has been given, and then what the next steps may need to be. And as Claire spoke to, far better to work proactively and confidently in this space than to shy away from action. And we would far rather somebody implemented a framework that we understand, and then we're able to subsequently review that and either enhance that or change the care that they've been given. But at least we can understand the framework that they've worked, that individual has delivered that care to. So consistency is paramount, and I would urge colleagues that are on this webinar to take a good look at 10-second triage, because, as I say, it is something that's been consistently embedded across the emergency services.
Yes, and I saw that recently myself. I went to a multi-age exercise in South Wales, and saw the use of the 10-second triage as part of the whole process of responding to a massive road traffic accident that they'd simulated. So it was really interesting to see it in practice. Mike, are you planning to put these into your kits? So now that you've heard all of that, would you have 10-second triage involved in one of your kits that people could get from you?
Definitely, I think it's saying to us, we've got our triage sheets in there to give people a bit of guidance of how to use the kits and how to triage a patient. But it sounds like there's a superb system already in place, which is tried and tested, and it's what the emergency services use. I think it's definitely the right way to go, clearly. So yes, we'll definitely be looking at updating that element of it. And and I think the other thing which is kind of tricky is the evac side of things. It's not something that we've always considered, the here and now treating a patient, but actually, yes, talking about the carry sheets and stretchers and things for evacuating people is another key area that I think we need to put more consideration into, really, for a complete package.
Yeah, it's interesting, this evacuation, because you just think of that as being the responsibility of the first responders to evacuate. So are we suggesting that the people in the venues under this legislation, I don't know whether it's a part of the legislation in terms of evacuation, but whether they should see themselves as being part of the evacuation as well as that initial response? What do you think, Claire?
I think that it may well become part of it, and I think it depends on the situation. If you look at, so we take Martyn's Law, and it describes the venues needing to identify a route to get casualties out or to get people locked down inside. So in a situation of a siege, at the point where that's released, quite a lot of people are going to need to potentially, if they're injured, be carried out at one time. And the thing that limits us moving people out is manpower. Now, if you look at emergency services response, fire and rescue services particularly have a role in evacuating casualties, but they may have another role to do as well if there's a fire, if there's other things to deal with. And traditionally, I mean, if we take Manchester, for instance, everybody that was carried out of that venue was carried out with police officers and bystanders helping them, because of the situation where we didn't have fire and ambulance coming into the city room. At the Bataclan, they were all carried out by police officers and fire officers under the direction of the doctors that worked with the raid, but again on barriers because people didn't have stretchers. So there's two elements to it. One is having something to carry people on that makes it easier, and the availability of those. So even if the people within the venue are not responsible for carrying them out, if there's an availability of carry sheets that allow people to start moving them out, that in itself is a step to not have to use the barriers and hoardings, etc. Because actually, when emergency services are responding, there's only there's a limit to the amount of equipment they can carry in with them. And then also it is just manpower. So if we find that there are people willing to help, you don't necessarily, and obviously there's health and safety and carrying and stuff, but actually in a situation where people's lives are at risk, I think people would help without being specifically trained in health and safety for that venue. And it's just having those people to carry people out, to keep that casualty flow, to get them to where they need to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because effectively you're talking about improvising as well, sort of doing what you can with what you've got. One of our questioners there says, even if you haven't got the kit, you don't, improvise. So I think it's a good point in terms of probably just not about evacuation, but also about that initial response as well, if it's not to hand. Because Mike, you talked about where the equipment should be in the venue, and that's conversations you're having. And maybe it's not nearby. maybe it isn't accessible. So improvising and being, maybe that's part of that kind of learning about how to think about planning and preparing, is about what happens when you haven't got it. Maybe that should be part of the thought process. So let me go back to the questions. So somebody here is asking about a specific date when training will be available. Again, that's not something we can answer here on this webinar. Again, the Home Office guidance hopefully will start to provide some clarity on that as that comes out. And then is there funding for blue light organisations to supply packed kits? I'm not aware that any funding is being given through any sources at all. I don't know, Mike, have you heard of anything yourself?
No, everybody we've worked with so far, it's all been funded privately by the venues themselves so far.
Okay, all right. Now, Claire, I was interested when we were talking before the call, you said that a major sporting venue had been in touch with you about how they should prepare and what they should be looking at. And I don't really want to say what the venue is particularly, but in terms of what were the kind of questions they came to you about in terms of being prepared for incidents like this. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So that was with regards to the venue having their own medical response within the venue. So a lot of bigger venues, certainly for sporting events, would have their medical response within the stadium, both for the players or for the athletes and for the crowd. But linking that sort of some learning. So one of the things I spent quite a lot of time doing is looking at the response to mass casualties and terrorist attacks and how we can improve outcomes. So they were asking for some of the learning that we've picked up from some of the events in the past, but also to discuss what that integration would look like with the emergency services and the health response. So I think certainly from going forward, some of the discussions I've had with people are certainly for the bigger venues, and all ambulance services will have a plan for all of the bigger venues that they could be called to, but to integrate, I think that health and emergency services response, but particularly from a health point of view, whoever's taking charge initially of the medical response within the venue, then how that looks with integrating with the health response with both the ambulance commanders and the medical advisors for the ambulance service, and how that handover looks, and actually how to make that as smooth as possible, because there's always time lost in someone being in command, handing it over, situational awareness, and to optimize the speed of that process, having planned it and talked about it and tabletopped it, certainly for the bigger venues where there's a potential risk, seems to be a sensible approach to me.
Yeah. And in terms of that conversation, did they talk specifically about, we are going to be having these new responsibilities under this legislation, we want to make sure that we're prepared, and we're already doing this stuff, so we're just double checking? Is it more of a kind of, yes, we're fine, we are doing this already? Is it that kind of conversation?
Actually, we didn't get as far as that. We haven't had we haven't been there yet. And it didn't specifically refer to Martyn's Law. I think it was just part of the planning that they were doing anyway, and it may have been prompted by Martyn's Law, but I certainly, I think the bigger venues often have that in place, because it's something that's always been a consideration. They've always had medical teams involved in some of those events, but I suppose specifically for maybe some smaller venues or venues that have a large audience on a fewer occasions, and that's not a normal thing to happen, then that may be something that is worth considering as part of their planning, and looking at how you would integrate that that response, whoever's taking the lead response, whether it's St John Ambulance or some other private event first aid provider within the venue, then how that integrates with emergency services. I certainly witnessed an exercise in Wales that I went to watch a few years ago, where they very much, it was a sporting venue, and they exercised that response of the stadium staff and the first aid response staff with the responding emergency services, and that was some really useful learning points that came out of that. So it's probably something that I think every venue should think about doing if they have the opportunity to.
Yes, and I think training exercise is something that the emergency services are very familiar with. In terms, you talked about desktop exercises there. I talked about the one I went to in South Wales. But of course, it's not going to be possible for the emergency services, and Phil, you'll speak to this, I'm sure, to be able to get involved with training and exercising for every venue, over 200 or 800 people. So Phil, what is your kind of advice on good practice there in terms of venues thinking about how they might test out how they're going to make themselves prepared in the way that we've described in this conversation? What can they do rather than simply relying on being part of an exercise, which they may never well?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And I think we've, as a group, responded to this question, throughout this webinar. Ultimately, that initial risk assessment and identification of appropriate control measures is paramount, and then sense checking that where it's appropriate to do so with professional bodies or emergency services as part of that kind of interaction that we'll inevitably have as part of the implementation of the law, and then our other statutory duties. I think Claire's also then spoke to the fact that what happens when, what are the contingency arrangements? So what happens if stretchers aren't available, or the person with the key to the room where the stretchers are locked up isn't available? We would ask our responsible people to do that due diligence, to sense check their plans, and to look at those sort of contingency arrangements. And you don't necessarily need to exercise those arrangements with emergency services or with other partners. There's that internal exercising that most certainly that venues can undertake to assure themselves that their protocols are fit for purpose. Claire also spoke to that integration piece. That's really important. Sense checking, it doesn't necessarily need to be a full-blown exercise with emergency service partners, but I think there will be ample opportunity, and emergency services, where it's feasible to do so, will be more than happy to engage and potentially exercise, where time permits, with sort of responsible people from venues. But the opportunity to sense check that the 10-second triage is appropriate, or the stretchers that they're procuring are effective and potentially aligned to the equipment that emergency services may use. All those sorts of questions and sense checks are all highly recommended, and certainly can be done internally and just through some fairly low level communications with partners, either in borough, with local authority partners, or local emergency services representatives. And then, of course, as I've pertained to there, for larger venues, certainly exercises will already be hosted as part of other statutory requirements, and there is always opportunity, and it's always good practice to look at new pieces of legislation or emerging trends, and to then subsequently build them into those exercises with partners to ensure that integration is effective, and that ultimately the response for members of the public is sound and expedites sort of transition to further medical care.
Yeah, you use lots of good fire words there about risks and controls and expediting. It's a language of the emergency services, but I think it just works in venues. This is not simply an emergency services world we're talking about here. So I think I'm interested in compliance. So Security Industry Association is the one that's going to be, the Security Industry Authority is the one that has the overarching enforcement of this legislation. It's looking for premises to notify them that they are, this legislation applies to them because of the nature of their venue, and that data, I hope, will be shared with the blue lights so that you should know anyway, I think, in terms of big venues, because it's all about your risks, isn't it, Phil, about you understanding your patch. But in terms of the kit itself, so Mike, I want to talk to you, because we're coming just almost to the end of time, this is whizzed by. It's around bleed kits and about knowing where they are. So we have something called the circuit for the location of defibrillators, so that if you have a defib in a venue and you register on something called the circuit, then the ambulance service and 999 service will know that the defib is nearby and can tell you to go and use it or unlock it, or however that works. I understand that you're thinking about doing something with bleed kits to work in a similar way. Could you just give us a quick update on your work there, please?
Yep. So there's been a new charity formed to map all the bleed kits across the UK, to make sure that information is being passed to the ambulance services, and to make sure they're managed correctly, just like defibs. Somebody's checking them. There's a request every 6 months to make sure that everybody is checking them. So it's called Bleed Map. The website's bleedmap.uk. Currently, there's about 3,700 kits on there. We know across the country there's over 30,000 bleed kits, but we also know we have a lot of those on things like trains where they're moving around. It's very hard to map things like that. So it's a bit like defibrillators. You can't put a static location on all of them. but we're kind of really now kind of urging everybody to, if they have a bleed kit, check it's on there. If it's not, get it registered, and then that gives us more information we can work with the ambulance services. We're starting to have conversations with the Association of Ambulance Chief Execs about how we can start integrating this more into the dispatch systems used by the ambulance services. And then it will also be the questions to the police and the fire services, because they equally need to know where these kits are just as much as the ambulance services. So it is very much early days for the project, but everything has to start somewhere.
No, I think that's great. I'm so pleased that you're doing that. I think that sounds like a really good thing. And at the moment, you're looking at like 10% actually on that system. I think you said about 3,000 is 30,000. So hopefully over time that will change. And again, for people to think about how they might do that. Will your kits come with information about that as standard, so that people know?
Exactly, yeah. So everyone comes with a little A5 thing, so please register it. And now it's talking to other manufacturers as well. So this isn't just about the kits that we produce or we're involved with. This is across the board for all bleed kits and pack kits and everything. It's about getting a national database, of where they all are for the ambulance service.
Good. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we don't have very long left, I'm afraid. I know there have been tons of questions, and I do apologise I haven't managed to get to all of them. There have been lots. We possibly might be able to answer some of those afterwards, but we'll check in on that later. In order to sort of bring our conversation to a close, we've covered lots of things there, and there are definitely some themes running through the conversation around this that I think are quite strong, around simplicity, a focus on stopping bleeding, thinking about evacuation. So I wonder if I could ask you each in turn to give one piece of advice for the people listening this afternoon about what they should go away and think about, because there is a lot to take in. What is the thing you'd like them to go away and talk to their colleagues about, or the person that they think is responsible under this legislation about what they should be doing next? So Claire, could I ask you to offer your one piece of advice, please?
So I think my piece of advice probably does have to be about stretchers and the availability of them. It's something I talk about in my talks I've given for quite a few years now. I know we've talked about it already today, but given we've covered quite a lot, I think simple stretchers, not complicated stretchers, just simple carry sheets, and whether a bag of those could be available to be brought to any scene where there's multiple casualties, not necessarily to be carried by the people there, but just to be available to assist in that casualty flow, because the key bit in saving lives here is maintaining casualty flow to get the casualties to the definitive care, which is where we're going to be able to save the most amount of lives.
Okay, all right, that's great. Thank you for that. Phil, can I come to you next, please?
No problem. I think I would say, please be proactive in this space. There's nothing to stop colleagues building this into their event planning assumptions now, in terms of understanding what risks may be posed to members of the public. And as a result of that, look at the control measures that are available to venue responsible people at this time. Look at good practices that are delivered by emergency services already. That will give them, a really good starter for 10 as to what might be appropriate in terms of initial medical prevention, for example, etc. And then obviously, as part of that leads to integration. It facilitates us all getting to work as quickly as possible and saving as many people, which I think Claire's spoken to there.
Excellent, thank you. And Mike, finally with you, what was your one piece of advice for our listeners?
I think it'd be to look where your medical kits are and the suitability of those medical kits. The speed of access in an emergency. It's kind of that age-old thing that every second counts, really, especially when it comes to things like catastrophic bleeding. So it's about the quick access and having the right kit in the right places, and it being visible. We see fire extinguishers everywhere, and they're just commonplace, but they are there in the open. And it should be the same with defibrillators and kind of packed kits and bleed kits, that they should be there, accessible, in secure housings for anybody to use in an emergency.
Brilliant. And it's great that you referenced the title of the webinar there as well, right kit in the right place. So thank you for that. Excellent. So just to summarize then, so that's stretchers, and think about evacuation. Don't just think about the beginning of the incident, think about the flow, and casualty flow is the phrase that Claire uses there. To be proactive, look at your controls. What are you presented with here? What does your location look like? And in terms of that location, think about the suitability of what you've got and where it is. So does it work? And I think, I would add to that just in terms of thinking it through, how would it work in practice? So I think there's an awful lot there for people to think about. We're not going to be able to tell people about training or guidance for this legislation. We're just going to have to wait for the Home Office to come through with more information. As it says, it's going to be ramping that up over the next next few months. I hopefully start to see some stuff. I know Fegan Murray, whose son who died in the Manchester Arena bombing, who's the legislation is named after him, and her incredible work to get this legislation on the statute books after 6-7 years. It's taken an awful lot of time, a huge commitment by her. So we're very grateful to her for sticking with it and making this happen, and it will make a huge difference. So I know she wants to make sure that everybody's, that is on that. I think it will be the 3rd of April 2027. That is the date for it to be implemented. So, lots and lots to do. So hopefully it's inspired people this afternoon by listening to us to go away, have a think about it, do some reading, and get going with it, really. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much, everybody, this afternoon for sharing your expertise, joining us. Thank you, Mike, for sponsoring the webinar. It's been great to have this topic in front of so many people. We've had a fantastic turnout, 512 people registered for it, which is amazing. Just as a huge level of interest. So thank you all for joining me. I'm going to do my outro speech now, so I'll let you go off to the wings. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so that just leaves me to thank you for watching us this afternoon. This webinar will be available on catch up as soon as I stop talking, so you can watch it all over again if you want to. Any notes we'll put on this, so I'll put the contact details on, the reference to the bleed circuit that Mike talked about, and anything else that we think will be useful, so you'll be able to grab those when you watch it again. If you are looking for CPD accreditation, we will send that to you by email, and you'll get that later, as I said, if you're on catch-up. We've got one more webinar for this year. We've done an awful lot in the last few weeks, and that is next Thursday, and that is about video solutions for emergency response. So join us for that if that is of interest. So do visit our website, emergencyservicestimes.com. We publish every single day, working day, and we provide a daily digest. So if you want to find out more, get it straight to your inbox 7 o'clock in the morning, then sign up for that as well. You can do that on the website. But it just leaves me to say thank you very much for watching.